Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. How you doing today? I really love this conversation with Bianca. What we talk about in this episode is Bianca is another therapist, and she talks about clients that come to her who feel like they are overwhelmed, anxious, not enough. They feel like they're too busy and don't have time for a breakdown. Maybe they've got issues with boundaries with family, people-pleasing, overextending themselves. They may be the first in their family to have gone to college. They feel like they have to save their family. Asking for help can be very, very difficult. And the family value is that family is very important. We talk about something called Black Superwoman Syndrome. And in the show notes at unapologeticallysensitive.com, if you go to the podcast page and click on Bianca's episode, she also talks about a video that she did on angry Black women. And if you have a reaction when you hear that, I think it's really important for you to hear the conversation about what that reaction may be about, because Black women have a lot to be angry about. I really am wanting to talk more about systemic racism, some misconceptions that we have. If you're somebody who's thinking like, that doesn't apply to me, I really would encourage you to listen to this episode, and whether you identify as Black or African American, or you're a person of color, or you're somebody who is in the majority and has experienced white privilege, this is not a hit you over the head episode about racism, but we do talk about why it can be difficult for Black people to not only come to therapy, but to identify their HS traits. And I just love the conversation that we had and what Bianca has to share about it. I always have this gremlin in my head that if you're listening, you're like, I'm not Black, I don't want to listen, or I'm not this, I'm not an amputee like with Joe Beckwith, I don't want to listen. Obviously, I have no control whether you stay tuned or not. What I would like to believe is that what we talk about is relatable to HSPs, and it's beyond what the content is. And, I have no control over what you're going to do. If you're new to the podcast, if you haven't already taken the podcast survey, or you have not gotten your 10 most downloaded episodes, you can go to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com. There's a banner there, and you can either take the podcast survey. I think I'm having a COVID moment. I know that it's in the show notes. I'm pretty sure that the podcast survey is on the website. There's a page. The good news is I went for a paddle this morning, and so it's not because I'm not doing anything. I think that there's a page, and on the contact me page at the bottom, you can take the podcast survey. It helps me get to know you, to create content. You can sign up for the newsletter. I will be launching some new courses. It's a great way to stay in touch. No pressure, no obligation. Let me tell you a little bit about Bianca. Bianca specializes in perfectionism, helping people embrace their imperfections and authenticity, be themselves. She helps clients work through concerns of self-worth, unhealthy relationships, identity, or feeling overwhelmed. Her approach within therapy is direct but open, meeting clients where they are, providing them freedom to change when they're ready. She believes in empowering and equipping people with skills, tools, and resources they can utilize for life. In addition, her passion is to eliminate mental health stigmas which are prevalent within the Black community, as well as eliminating the gap between Christianity and therapy. Bianca Hughes is a licensed professional counselor in Georgia, podcast host, speaker, and authenticity coach. And now, on to the show. Oops. It's one of those days. Fooled ya. I forgot to mention that Bianca and I recorded about 30 minutes worth of this episode, and then her laptop died and the recording dumped out. We are about half an hour after recording, and I'm waiting for a downloaded copy of this second part, the first part that we did, and it hasn't come through yet. The point being that At some point, it's going to drop off and end, and then we're going to pick up again. I'm going to see if I can do something to let you know that it's coming. If not, remember, done is better than perfect, and it's all great content. And this is how we deal with life when it happens. And now, on to the show. Hey, Bianca, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Very happy.
I'm really excited about this conversation. Let's start out where I normally start out. Do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
I do. Thank God I do. I think you kind of pointed me out to me, Patricia.
Serious?
Yeah. In a group, and when we were talking about something in a group, and I was mentioning that I'm an introvert, and someone's like, well, no, you're not. And I'm like, well, I get really overwhelmed. And you're like, well, maybe you're a extroverted HSP.
Okay. I always feel bad when I don't remember those conversations initially. So that's what my silence is. How do I respond to this and still sound like I'm involved and that I care if I don't remember? But that does sound like something I would say. When did you find out you were an HSP? Was it around that time then?
Yeah, I think though also I had heard some other stuff about it. So it might be about a year or two and you've read about it and you're like, and then you hear it again and then it's like, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about the term highly sensitive person?
I think the owner thoughts are good thoughts in sense of it's relieving. I think, yeah, it's relieving. Like when I would hear other therapists talk about they see all these clients and I would just be like, that's exhausting. I would think something was wrong with me.
When other therapists have a very high caseload, that the number of clients that they see per week based on compared to how many people, if you're highly sensitive, we see is considerably less.
Yeah. And I thought something was wrong with me or that I wasn't a good therapist. I wasn't doing a good job. So it was very relieving.
Yeah. It's interesting in the episode that has already come out where Shelley Aaron interviewed me for the anniversary interview. In order to accommodate our schedules, I go kayaking a couple times a week and I don't usually see clients until later in the afternoon, but to accommodate her schedule, we met earlier. And the first day that we met, I just did not have time to transition. And it was hard for me. And I realized it doesn't work for me to come home, hurry up, change, and then jump into something else. I really do need more time for that transition. And as HSPs, we often do better if we're not working full time, or if we're therapists or coaches, we don't see as many clients as other people do, or we need more time between clients or between one activity and another. And I just was observing myself like, this isn't really working out so well with me. And sometimes we just do what we need to do, but I could tell that I was not very grounded and really ready to do the interview.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. And having to make all these adjustments and sometimes feel guilty, like, why are you not working? Like, why are you doing all this? It's like, you need to work, but
right.
That's just not how you get the best out of me or how I get the best out of myself. Like even my business partner, he'll go to me every once in a while, like, have you been to the river? And I'm like, no, I haven't. Like he'll know. He's like, yeah, I think you need to go.
It is so important. I was just talking with a friend this morning who's a therapist and is looking into other career opportunities. And so financially, things are a little bit unstable for her. And she lives in Canada. And she was saying, I really want to get a snowboarding lift pass, I think. I don't know. I don't live in Canada. I don't snowboard. So y'all know what I mean. So whatever you need so that you can snowboard, and was wondering, should I spend the extra money? And we talked about it's something that brings you joy. And especially in this time of transition, you've got to be participating in the things that really make you feel alive and connected, because that's how we strive, especially when there's stress going on. So yeah, so you go to the river, I paddle, she snowboards.
Yeah. You've got to find something. We all find something like, yeah. That brings joy. Yes. We have to.
It's especially right now, but we're not going to go into that. We haven't really nailed down exactly what we're going to talk about. We have an idea. What we had talked about was talking about Black Superwoman Syndrome and what makes it hard if you are Black to honor your sensitivity. where I think I'd like to start, and let me just pause for a second. Is there anything around that you want to correct in how I said that? Because I'm feeling so, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. And the only way I'm ever going to get good is to practice.
No, I'm totally fine with the word Black. And actually it works better for me because I do live in America, but I'm not African American. I was not born here. I was born in London. So for me, the term Black is appropriate. And that's the name of it anyway. It's not African American Superwoman. That's actually, it's like a paper and it's a syndrome and it's official. So that's actually the term. So yeah.
Okay. Just personally, what do you think about the term person of color?
Do you know that term was only familiar to me when I moved to America? It's definitely used way more here than it was growing up. We use it and people do use it, but the terms that we used would be Black or Afro-Caribbean because my parents are from the Caribbean.
Okay.
People of color was not a term that was used. Yeah, for us. And then you'll have stuff like if their parents were Black and white, then it would be used, the term was used mixed race. So that's a more of a newer term, but it does have its distinctions, right? Because I can go to an event and some events are Black women. They actually say Black women because people of color, you know, of course means Latinos or Latinx. And so everyone's different. So I do go to some spaces and they're like Black women. So there is a distinction. I just go with whatever people's comfortable with. I mean, my preference is Black.
Yeah. And I think it's really important if you're someone like me that is not really sure, ask the person. It's really up to the person. It's the same with somebody's pronouns. It's not for me to decide what somebody's gender or pronouns or for me to come to you and say, well, my understanding is that person of color is the appropriate thing. If you identify as Black, then it's my job to honor what you want and to say, okay, we're going to refer to you as Black then.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I remember being trained and actually she was training. Yeah, she was a Black trainer and she even asked me like, what do you prefer to be referred to? And she was actually a Black woman because actually people do get confused sometimes and do approach me as an African American. And I think it's important that we do ask people that because I'm Black. And so if you say African American, for me, you're missing out all of my cultural heritage and where I was raised in London and then my cultural heritage of the Caribbean, it kind of gets X'd out. So I agree that it's important. And I think that's something I've learned when you come from another country, you'll notice, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if you ever know anyone who's not from America, there's a common theme of asking you where you're from and about your culture and about your background. And so that's another thing that I kind of have learned to do. When you come from another country, you tend to be in tune with that person's culture and ask about that. So, those are things that we just learn and that you just learn that works. So when you are an immigrant and you have a different experience, you change your language and you ask those questions.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm just really where my mind went. And then I was doing some like, do I want to say this? Do I not want to say that? I can't tell you how much that goes on with me. I think Americans tend to be, we just think everybody's like us. We don't often see diversity. We think everybody has the same world perspective that we do. And we don't really have that honoring of culture is unique. Language is unique. Life experience is unique, even among people from the US. And then if you come from somewhere outside of the US, I don't know that everybody is always really honoring about that.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the culture. Like, I don't know. Some people say Americans don't have culture. I never understand that, but because everybody has a culture. I mean, I have actually Americans tell me that, and I'm like, everyone has a culture, but that's just the culture, right? And that's just what you have to recognize. That's how you was raised. It's very, in the schools, it's very much about America, and so I think that's just the culture. And then when you immerse yourself in different cultures and you travel, then you get that opportunity.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's just very much, it's the culture here.
Well, it's very ethnocentric. that I think that my worldview is everybody's worldview, as opposed to my worldview is my worldview through my ethnicity and my culture, and everybody has a unique view. So let's talk a little bit about what is Black Superwoman Syndrome.
Yeah, it was I don't want to butcher it. I'll send you the link, but it's a paper written, so anyone can really read it. It's online. It was actually done in a study by a nurse in, I think, North or South Carolina. And it was a study just amongst Black women, and just the Black Women's Syndrome has, like, I think it's five aspects. But basically the sense is that you are getting away from the stereotypes of the Black mommy, lazy. So that means that you're tending to work really hard. There's a tendency, another one is a tendency to work in the sense and take care of the family. You have to do really hard educationally. And then the other one is you have got to figure it all out. There is no room, time, or space for emotions and to feel. I like to, I work with people who deal with perfectionism. I like to call it a form of perfectionism, in the sense that you have to do all these things right. And people cannot see you crack. That is not okay.
I mean, as I'm hearing you talk, I just think about these are all survival, all things that we do for survival. And if you look at where Blacks came from, it makes sense. And so having time to feel into things, that just would be incredibly unsafe.
Yeah, it's unsafe, and it wasn't also passed down. When you think about enslavement and then the end of slavery, they were just left to figure it out. There was no therapy.
Yeah.
That gets passed down through the genetics of the intergenerational trauma. Like, that gets passed down through the epigenetics of that characteristic and of that behavior that you've got to work. You've got to work, and work real hard, because there is no time for rest. It's not okay for you to rest, because if you rested, when you were enslaved, like, you got beat, you could die. And that gets passed down because there's no changing the narrative, right? There's no cognitive behavioral therapy for that. But then also the society is also showing you that as well. And so you are literally in survival mode in that sense. And you've got to do well. But again, because if you mess up and they see you crack, then you lose it, right? You lose everything. You don't make it.
Well, and looking at historically, Blacks not being seen as people, but legally being treated as property and not even having the right to vote. I suck at history. If you know when Blacks had the right to vote and when Blacks were also given some constitutional rights because they were seen as property.
No, not in American history, no. As much as that. For me, it's a bit different because, of course, my ancestry, they were still, of course, enslaved, which I was reading one time that actually my mom's from Jamaica, my dad's from Antigua, that more Africans were stolen from Africa and taken to Jamaica than there were actually in the United States. But because they were treated so badly, they died so quickly.
Yeah.
It's a bit different for me in that sense. But voting rights, less than human. There's so much of these things that you are trying to get through. Like, why on earth would you have to be superwoman? Like, when you think about it, you have to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
There wasn't another option. You didn't feel like it was another option.
Well, and I'm thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization, which is where we have feelings and reflection and thinking about the meaning of life. And if you're in survival mode because you don't have any rights to do anything beyond survive, why would you even go there? How does this show up with your experience? How does this show up currently with people who are Black and may have the trait of high sensitivity? What do you see in your practice? What's your experience? Because obviously if epigenetics passes it down and this is not what families learn, then I would imagine that would be challenging if you're a highly sensitive person and culturally you haven't learned, or I'm not even sure how to phrase it, but can you pick up and make me sound,
yeah.
sound better?
Yeah. What I see is, I mean, this is society, but also is the feelings, right? The space to feel, the space to cry. I think the biggest thing is I don't have time. I don't have time. That's what it is. I don't have time for a breakdown. I don't have time to cry. That is what it is. When I think about it, it's, I don't have time for this. Even I do it. I do that. I did it the other day in therapy. Like I broke down, but I was like, I still don't have time to break down. My therapy session, right? I don't have time. Like my therapist, I remember they asked me, what would you do if it all fall apart? I said, I'll be overwhelmed. And they're like, well, then what you do? I was like, I don't know. Like, so you don't even think past it falling apart. Like it can't fall apart. What do you mean? So I think the biggest thing is I don't have time for a breakdown. I don't have time to feel. Right. Because if I do that, I don't know what to do next or how the world would run.
Right. Well, I'm always hesitating. Here's what my experience is, and tell me if this relates. That there's this fear of it's like a pressure cooker that constantly, adding little bits of feelings. And so it pressure until we blow a gasket. We either lose our shirt or we have a meltdown. And that fear of if I allow myself to feel, I will be so overwhelmed that I will not be able to function, because we don't know that if we have a feeling and we feel it and we experience it, then we move on to the next thing. But I don't know if I'm missing something culturally there with what you're talking about. So that was what my reluctance in sharing that was. Because
there's no one else to take care of stuff. You're talking about single women. You're talking about single moms. You're talking about head of households. You're talking about I take care of all of my family members. And my kids. I'm running my own business. I've got to be different. I've got to make it for the family. I've got to prove that I'm not a lazy Black woman. I've got to prove that I'm smart. I've got to prove that to my boss. I can't break down in this corporate environment because they're already giving me a hard time and already have a stereotype of me. So I don't have time for that. That's why.
Yeah.
Because all these other things are going around me. So I don't have time because I've got to I've got to not live up to the stereotype and things like that.
Sure. How likely is someone who's got Superwoman Syndrome to come seek out therapy?
Oh, they're likely because it's changing. Black women are tired and fed up. They are realizing they don't have to do it all. And I don't know if they'll know it or call it that or come in for that. They'll come in because they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's what my next question was, is what are the general presenting problems that somebody comes to therapy? Feeling overwhelmed. What else?
They're overwhelmed. They're anxious. They're struggling in their job. Of course, I put in that perfectionism. They don't feel like they're enough or doing enough. So I think that's when they're coming in, when it just gets too much. They've tried everything they could do and it's just way too much. Yeah. They're just like, they're at their breaking point.
Yeah. What percentage of the people that you see, is your practice mostly Black people?
Predominantly. I never intended it that way, but predominantly. It's predominantly women. I got a few men, but it's predominantly women. That women is my main focus. But yeah, the majority are Black women, especially in this climate.
Yeah, we need Black therapists right now more than ever. We really, really do. I had someone reach out to me for a consult and she was Black. And I asked if she had talked to any other Black therapists, and I explained what I was happy. She was a highly sensitive person. This happens commonly that somebody's highly sensitive and they come to work with me. But if there's another section that I'm not competent in, we run into the problem, depending on what the presenting problem is. If we get to, you have issues in this other area that I'm not an expert in, then we need to look at that. And she hadn't even considered that. But we need Black therapists right now more than ever. Of the clients that come to you, how many would you say are highly sensitive? Do you know?
I have never assessed that. But as I'm coming, so I recognize that perfectionism, but as I'm coming more into my acceptance of my HSP, so you got to understand I'm just accepting it, that then I'll look at for more in my client. Mm-hmm. So if I think about my clients I have now, I think a lot more than they realize, if I'm going to be totally honest. Like if I just think about a few in my head. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Dr. Ahrens, the research says that about half of our clients in therapy are highly sensitive because we want to learn, we want to grow. So there is a high percentage. And those are your clients that generally are the ones that come on time, that pay on time, that do homework, that want to do homework, that want to dive deep, that really, they want to, even though it's hard, they really want to do the work because they're invested in their own well-being. And it's interesting. I was thinking today, I have a client who took the online HSP course that I teach. I've worked with this client for a number of years, and I don't think I would have identified them as highly sensitive. They have a tremendous amount of trauma, and because of that, the trait just wasn't there. But when we started talking about it and this client listened to the podcast, they identified as highly sensitive. So we talked about it more. So I think we also have clients that we may not spot as highly sensitive because of trauma.
Yeah, I can see how trauma can mask that. Yeah. And I think also, but then that's a factor I was reading as well, that highly sensitive people respond differently to trauma or more. So that could be another factor too, right? That,
well, there's differential susceptibility, and what Dr. Ahrens' research shows is if a child has a difficult childhood, they have a higher rates of anxiety and depression, and oftentimes with complex PTSD, CPTSD. People often think that causes the high sensitivity. It doesn't. They're two separate things. But if you have somebody who's innately highly sensitive, it's a genetic innate trait, and then you've got complex PTSD on top of that, those people are not going to fare as well, because differential susceptibility says you put an HSP in a positive situation, we do better than the other 80%. You put us in a poor situation, trauma, we're going to fare worse than the other 80%. The good news is that if you get a good fit with a therapist, then again, we'll do better than the other 80%. So there's tremendous hope if you are someone who's experienced trauma or struggles or suffers, that we do better than the other 80% if you get someone that's a really good fit.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So circling back to where we started from, I'm just trying to think of the listener of somebody who may be experiencing Superwoman Syndrome, may not know, well, I guess if they're listening to the podcast, they probably have a sense that they're an HSP, but may not be aware of the Superwoman Syndrome. What is important for you to tell that person to help put the pieces together? And I'm at this point, I don't even know what those pieces are.
It's so much. So it's like,
I know.
I'm going to go with what comes to my head first. I always go with that. Boundaries, recognizing your poor boundaries, especially when it comes to family members. And people pleasing, overextending yourself, feeling like you have to save the family, or you're expected to save the family, especially if you're a first, like the first one to go to college, first one to get your master's, first one to get those types of first ones to buy a house in your family, are some signs, and setting those boundaries because their expectation is for you to sometimes, help them. Another one is, and so that means getting better boundaries, right? And working on those boundaries, which is really, really hard, especially in the Black family. Well, family is very, very important, and you don't want to disrespect the family. So it's very, very hard.
Yeah.
Because that's fear, and then, things like that. Asking for help. That is the hardest thing. Because if you ask for help, that means you can't do it all, and you're no longer that superwoman. But no one can do it all. Mm-hmm. No one can. We want, I always talk about we're wired to connect. We're wired to belong. We're wired for a relationship. That is a natural human thing. Like, even if you think about animals, there ain't no animal that's alone. Like, especially mammals, they're not alone. They stay in packs, and we're the same. And so asking for help. And if you're expected to do all these things and you're wearing this mask of I've got it all and I'm doing it all, that's really hard and really, really scary. And it's very vulnerable. And you don't want people to take advantage of you. And then if you've got this HSP, you don't want to be hurt and you don't want to be rejected. And another thing is I think you may not realize you're a HSP because you've become so hardened. I definitely realized that I become hardened, and I'm not a naturally hardened person. I'm so loving and so caring. And then it gets to that point and I'm like, oh, I've gone a bit hardened again because things keep happening. So I think that, like, if you know that you really are a sweetheart, but you're like hard as nails and everyone may think you're a bitch, most of the time, like, I love like clients like that. I love clients that give me the hardest time because I know they're like protecting themselves. So that's another thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of recognize and then kind of be like, okay, I have to find a space where that could be nurtured, my sensitive nature. And because that's a weight that you're carrying too, right?
Yeah. I often see HSPs fall into two categories depending on how they were raised. So how I was raised, feelings were not okay. So I am very analytical, very in my head. I couldn't tell you what a feeling was. And as I've done my own healing work, I cry at commercials now because I'm in touch with that part of me. Other people tend to be very much in their emotions. And I often, what I see is emotional dysregulation because they feel so much and because we have so much empathy and we tend to be reactive or responsive. Those are the folks that need to learn how to come a little bit to the other side. Do you see any trends in the clients that you see or in the Black community?
Yeah, the trend is more no emotions, for sure. Yeah. It's definitely, they're not allowed because we don't have time. We don't have time. They represent weakness. That's the biggest thing I get with tears is weakness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's more of emotions are not allowed to be displayed because if you do, you're weak.
Yeah.
So I think, it's changing, I think, in younger families. Like if you're a parent and you have young kids, that's changing. But if you're an adult in your 20s, 30s, 40s, you would have been raised, majority of them are raised that we don't do emotions.
Yeah. I can tell you in every single HSP course that I've taught, when somebody cries, they apologize. We have the conversation like, no need to, like, we welcome tears here. We celebrate tears. Tears are healing. But inevitably, people apologize every single time they start to cry. So it doesn't matter who you are, that message of crying is not okay and that it's a weakness and it's tremendous strength. And I love what you said. We are wired for connection, and asking for help in that sense of interdependence is such a healthy thing. And with the perfectionism, when we allow people to see our messy parts, that's really where the connection starts. But we hustle so hard to cover that up, thinking that if people saw that, they wouldn't care for us. And that's often what is the most vulnerable, attractive part of us, is that raw, imperfect part of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that language is beautiful, but that's not the language you hear. Yeah. That's not in trying to work through that language, because I'm like telling it's beautiful. Someone else would be like, what is she talking about? Like, we don't have time for that. Like, that's just psychobabble, like what you said. But it's so valuable.
We had a little technical difficulty, and right midstream, we lost our connection. So we're back, and this is an exercise in flexibility.
I love podcasting. You could do that. You can mess up and come back and put it all together. And I love that. It's not live.
Yeah. No, and this is what happens. So we just manage. So we had started talking before we started recording, and what I was asking you is, if you have clients that come to you that are really where their experience is, there is no time, they're not even at a place where they can start talking about their feelings or being highly sensitive. So how do you manage that, and what do you see in your practice?
I was saying that, you know, like any other therapist, you manage certain things, but my clients have an extra layer or a different layer. That's why they come and see a Black therapist. So they don't have to explain certain things to a white therapist. I think that helps them to, in a way, to settle in. So, you know, any client that comes in to any practice is already apprehensive. And then you're Black, even though I always explain to clients that, yes, I am Black, but I'm also English as well. So I always explain that there may be some differences in culture and language. But for the most part, we have very similar experiences. And so you have to get them to a place where they feel comfortable, because you already have the stigma with mental health in the Black community. So throwing things like HSP and all these words out is just not going to fly, because there's already this apprehension, there's already this stigma, there's already friends worrying about them, or family, or like, why would you do that? And are you crazy? So you have to literally build up that relationship. And I think for some people, saying things and asking questions about HSP or things like Myers-Briggs is a great introduction if they've done it, finding out if they have done any form of strength training, like Strength Finder. Strength Finder is my favorite. So if you know that they already have done those sort of tests, then you can bring in the HSP. Do you find that you're sensitive? What have people said to you growing up? Did people call you, a crybaby? Did people say you were sensitive? Or you take things to heart too much? Do you hear that often? So if you know when to bring those questions in, then you can say, well, have you considered this? And that takes a few sessions, because they have so much stuff to deal with themselves, with their family, and then with the world, and in their jobs, and in their roles and their responsibility. Bringing that in is like another thing. And so I think that it comes in to help them understand themselves. And it comes in at a point where they're more receptive and not less judgmental of themselves. And they're more receptive to understanding who they are and how they're wired. So you bring it into like, well, this may be how you're wired and why you respond this way. So it takes a bit of time, just because of the trusting factor. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Of therapy in general. So that's what I think that you have to be sensitive to.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at time, and I wasn't really clear on where we were at when we dumped out, but I'm looking at the clock, and I have a feeling that it's time to start wrapping up. So what have we not talked about that's important to cover before we end?
What I always like to say is letting people know they're not alone, especially if you are a Black person listening to this, that you're not crazy, that it is okay to be sensitive. I think that anyone who's listening is not Black, and you may have heard of the angry Black woman stereotype.
Thank you for bringing this up.
I actually did a video on that from a therapeutic perspective. And I was like, well, we all know anger is a secondary emotion. So to entitle someone the angry Black woman is totally incorrect, because we know that's a secondary emotion. And we know most of that is coming from hurt and pain. And so if you want to stereotype and judge, that actually may be your most sensitive person you've ever known. And that's their way of protection with all the stuff they've got going on.
Yeah. And if a Black woman is angry, she has a heck of a lot to be angry about. And if you are not Black and don't understand that, then you might want to do a little bit of anti-racism work, because I think there's such a misconception there, and it's so easy for us to judge what we don't like in ourselves. If we identify with our sensitivity, that anger can feel very threatening. I love what you said of it's probably someone who has a lot of sensitivity, and in order to survive, you have a lot to be angry about.
Yeah, and you're not being heard and you're being dismissed all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you send me a link to that video and I can put it in the show notes?
I'll put it in the show notes. I mean, sure, I'll email it to you. Like it's my podcast. Sorry, everyone, listen, I have my own podcast, so it's not my show.
You can do my show notes for me. I'd be okay with that.
See, that's another thing. I was reading. I'll add this. I was reading about this, is that you want to do it all. You want to help the world, right? But you're just so exhausted. And sometimes I feel, I read that recently, and sometimes I heard it. I think I was listening or read it. And sometimes I feel like a failure because I have so much ideas, right? But I'm exhausted to execute them. And that's, again, we're coming back and asking for help and getting the support and delegating. But like my mind runs 1,000 miles a minute, but then my rest of my body is like, we can't do this. Like we can't do that. Yeah. I think that's another thing to recognize, that you do have all these ideas, and not that you necessarily slow down, but you just need to get help to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I'm a great idea person. In my ideal world, I would have a team of people that I would come up with ideas and they would figure out how to execute it, because that's not where my strengths are. And because of my high sensation seeking, I like the novelty of coming up with ideas, but often having to do things over and over and to figure things out. It's not fun anymore. And so that's the other aspect that we need to factor in, that we often tell ourselves that we don't follow through with things or we give up on things. And it's like, no, we just are great at one part and we need to get support in other areas.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah, we do. We do. And we do business differently, for anyone who's listening, because there is Black women are doing so well. Like they're the number one in new businesses, creating new businesses. Black women are doing so well. So there's such a pressure to do well. Again, going back to that Black Superwoman. But I just want to know, if you are a business owner, that you do you do business differently when you're a highly sensitive person. But there's such a big push within the Black community to do so well and to run your own business and to leave your daytime job and things like that. And that may not be for you. If you're feeling like you can't do it, it's not that you're not good at business.
Right. Well, I started a private practice in 2007, and I went to a course for, $130. It gave me a little booklet and told me what I needed to do to start my own practice. And I thought, yay, here I am. I bought a mailing list and I got an office, and I really had no idea all the different hats that I had to wear as a business owner. And I swore I was never going to do that again, that I liked working for somebody else. And then I had something really unexpected happened at work where I thought I'd stay and retire, and it propelled me to where I'm at now. So it was a good thing. And it makes sense that if you go into business and you really don't understand everything that's involved, it can be really daunting, because even if you just look at how our brains work and what we're skilled at and unskilled at, we have to show up and do things that we may not be very good at. Doesn't mean we can't learn it, but it can make it much more challenging.
Yeah. And I want to speak to that, because you got all this, no one can see this, but she's got all this lovely green and stuff. I think being in nature has been the number one best thing. Like I've always liked water, but I never knew how important it was. I would say this, like, because I'm a believer, but I do feel like God placed me in the house that I needed to be in. And it was like years down the line that I realized there was a river that I could walk to. And then I discovered all these trails. And there about a year ago, I discovered like there's this waterfall that's like 5 minutes from my house, right? And again, going back to not having time to discover nature, to be in nature. And I have found that that's so key. But whenever I go to these places, it's predominantly white people there. There are some times you find a Black and you're like, oh, hey, what's up? But it's predominantly white people. But for a highly sensitive person, nature is like so key. And I do encourage Black women or any Black person listening to this to really kind of step out of that to feed that sensitive part of you, because that's like my lifeline. Like, yeah.
Yeah. And it can be done so simply. I went to a silent retreat a little over a year ago. It was an 8-day silent retreat. And I came home and realized how much I love being in nature. So I have a bird feeder right outside my window. We put sunflower seeds in it. We have squirrels that come. I got a hummingbird feeder. We have a little fountain so the birds come. So I have this ability, even when I'm inside working, I have this bank of windows that overlooks the front of the house and the street. But there's always stuff that's entertaining to me because I realized how much I love that connection with nature, and it just brings me joy. So it's a way to kind of even bring nature a little bit closer when I'm inside working.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. Gotta be creative.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else that we need to cover that we didn't? I feel like there's so much more to dive into.
I mean, like you said, there's so much more. I could, probably talk forever on this, but I think that I like to give people stuff to chew on, and I feel like we've given them enough to kind of chew on and just kind of think about and do some more research on to think about and find for themselves. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us about your podcast? Tell us where people can find you, any offerings that you have. Are you accepting clients right now?
I am, first of all, everyone, I am based in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm licensed in the state of Georgia. Right now, as of this date, no, I'm full with clients, but I'm not sure when this comes out. So maybe just try and reach out to me. But I'm just licensed in the state of Georgia. My practice is Authentically Be You Counseling. And that's also on my Instagram is Authentically Be You. And then my podcast is the Authentic Wednesday podcast. My tagline is embrace your imperfections and authentically be you. So the therapy really deals with the perfectionism side of things. And then the podcast is like, this is what it's like to be authentic. And I'm sharing my everyday stories of pushing through that perfectionism and what it means to live an authentic life. And then my guests as well are sharing their stories and how they've become to live in their truth and be authentic. So that's the Authentic Wednesday podcast for that as well. And that's on Instagram, same name, and on Facebook. So yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been a great conversation. It's so interesting that as you were talking, I was thinking about things, and knowing that that's my frame of reference, I was thinking about childhood emotional neglect, the difficulty asking for help, and refraining, because thinking about, is childhood emotional neglect, how culturally sensitive is that point of view, and does that relate? So it's just interesting. When I hear a different perspective, I think it's normal that we want to fit things into the already existing schemas that we have. And so just chewing on that for right now.
Cool. I love that. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's wonderful being on here. I really appreciate and thank you for helping me, allowing me to talk to your audience.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Hey again. I'm always curious to know how these episodes go. I don't have enough time to digest them after I record them, and just always curious to know if you related, if you didn't relate it, what you thought. I really am curious about this part of having a difficult time asking for help. And I am curious to know, just across the board, not looking at culture, I think many of us have a hard time asking for help, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like there's really no time to stop. So I'm just curious if that felt relatable to you or not. If you are interested in working with me, if you're interested in the online HSP group, you can go to my website, unapologeticallysensitive.com. There's a tab for the HSP groups. I will be starting them up again in January, and I would love to have you as part of the group. If you identified with some of the things that you heard in this episode, I would be more than happy to work with you. I'm trying to think of when you're going to be hearing this episode. It will be after the election. So how are you holding up? How are you doing? I have COVID brain today. This is the best that I have to offer, and it's good enough, and I'm good enough. I hope you're doing well. Please know that whatever you're doing today, you are enough. You've done enough. It's okay to rest. It's okay to ask for help. And if you're in a place where you're not there yet, that's really okay too. There's really nothing that you can do to mess things up. You're exactly where you need to be. Thank you so much for being here today. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.